Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 48 of the Bill Podcast, and in this episode we'll be going through PhantomJS, which is a headless WebKit browser. So this is the main web page of PhantomJS, which is phantomjs.org, and over here with a simple download click we'll be able to get the executable. And this web page also gives us link to the source code, documentation, and more importantly the examples are really useful. This is also the GitHub page, and I find the wiki pages really useful to understand the API and more documentation, and even some links to things such as the ecosystem, for example Casper.js or Mocha PhantomJS, some of the tools that we can use along with PhantomJS. But for this episode we'll be focusing just on PhantomJS. Yes, and this is the wiki page. We will be taking a lot of examples from here as well, and we'll be building a little application where we can run this headless browser. Now, before we get on to the project and installing PhantomJS, what is a headless browser? Now, I came across this article, and of course, this is fairly old, but I felt the concept of headless browser, or more importantly, why we should have and use for a headless browser, come across really easily through this article. And most important answers that I found to this question was to be able to extract data and to test the web pages. And because we can execute this headless browser through command line, it is easily scriptable, and basically this means we can automate a lot of testing. Finally, before we go off to install the PhantomJS, I came across this little gist on the list of other types of headless browsers. So PhantomJS is definitely one of them. There is also things like Simple Browser, which is .NET and C# based, or even Slimmer.js, which is Gecko or Firefox's web browser engine. Great, so before I get started with the PhantomJS, I'm in my desktop, which only has one folder, an empty folder called Phantom. And here, if you want to execute the PhantomJS through command line, all you need to do is PhantomJS, but guess what? It is obviously not installed in my machine as of now. So let's go ahead to the main website, which is phantomjs.org, and let's download this file. Once you come to the download page, you will have different operating systems, and I'm going to choose the Mac OS X. So there you go. I have extracted the folder containing PhantomJS, the latest version 1.9.1. Now this folder will come with a lot of developer related files, for example changelog, license, third-party examples, and the most important one is the bin folder, and over here you'll find the executable. So let me go ahead and drag it to this folder where I usually store all my executables. And now let me go ahead and restart the terminal, and if you go ahead and query PhantomJS -version, yep, it will show us the latest version. The next command line that I like to use is obviously the help one, which is --help, and this will basically give us a list of the most commonly used command line options for PhantomJS. Finally, before we dive into PhantomJS, it also comes with its own REPL, and this REPL can be started with a simple command PhantomJS. And you'll see this sort of prompt here. And let's just execute some very simple JavaScript. So if you want a quick REPL for PhantomJS, yep, this is available as well. And as like any other REPL, we can quit it with a Control-C. Great, so let me get inside the folder Phantom and open it up in Sublime Text. And obviously this folder is completely empty as of now. Why don't we go ahead and create a very simple file? So I'm just call it number 1, which is hello.js. And very simply, like what we did in the REPL, we'll just say console log. And in PhantomJS, we have to include this function called phantom.exit, very important, so that the headless browser will not keep on running. Great, so now that this file is all ready, let's come back to our command line. Make sure that the file is available in our current directory, and we can just execute it with PhantomJS and then the file name. And there you go. A very simple console log is executed. So let's try something fun. How about taking a screenshot? So let me start a new file called screenshot.js. And over here, we will acquire a library, and that will simply be web page. And usually to initialize this, we can start with the function create. Great, so now let's go ahead and open up a URL. How about say google.com? And next we pass in an inline function. And over here, all we need to do is page render, and let's give it a name. Let's say google.jpg. And finally, and more importantly, we need to exit the headless browser. So notice here, my folder currently does not have the picture, which is google.jpg. Why don't we go ahead and run this? So very similarly, I'll do PhantomJS, but this time it will be file number 2. Looks like it has executed. And there you go, you'll see a brand new file called google.jpg. And yep, if we come back to our Finder, there is this little image that has been created. So as you can see, this is very useful for testing purpose. Why don't we try one last very simple example before we will go on to a little project. So let's say this one will basically record the time taken to load the page. So we will use the same library, or rather the module, which is require and then web page, and we will initialize it with the function create. And we will also have another variable called t, and this will basically be the current time. Next, just like the previous example, we will open up a web page. Why don't we open up flickr.com in this case? And we'll pass in an inline function, and this will basically minus off from the previously stored current date. And maybe it will do a little console log to kind of say, hey, the loading time. And this will basically be in milliseconds. And finally, as always, phantom.exit. Great, so let's go ahead and execute this. So just like the previous two examples, I'll do phantom and then the file name. And there you go, it seems like Flickr is taking about 6 seconds. So now all you have to do is replace the Flickr with other websites as simply as this, and go ahead and execute the same file again. Looks like Google is taking about 1.4 seconds. Now before we go on, I would really highly recommend this wiki page, and there are tons of very good examples. Let me give you an example of the page loading that we did so far. And here the example is pretty cool in the sense that you can store the URL as a variable, or you can even take in a command line argument to put in the web page. Or also lastly, you can do some if else to kind of check whether the page is loading. Some good practices to implement when we are using PhantomJS for real projects. Next up, we will have a very little project that we will create and run in our local host. And basically, we'll be using a lot of the API references. So if you click the API reference, which will basically document all of the functions that we can use in PhantomJS, you'll see that basically there are about 5 types of APIs. So we'll be concentrating on the first 3, which is the web page to system and the file system. Right, so I'll come back to my text editor, and over here I'll create a brand new folder and call it project. And inside the project, I will have one file called index.html. So let's just put the title as hello PhantomJS. And let's just say inside the body, I will have a little header one. And it will basically say I'm exploring PhantomJS. And next up, we will also have the image, a little image that we'll find from the Google search. And we'll just have the PhantomJS logo with a very simple alt text. Great, that's about it. Why don't we run this with a server? So in another terminal tab, so let me get inside the project folder, and with the Python HTTP simple server, I'll start off a server in localhost port 8000. So obviously I don't have the image here, so let me go ahead and put the image. So this image looks pretty good. So view original image. Let me just save this right inside the project folder. And yep, our little web page is ready. Great, so let me come back and create a new file called project.js. So let's do some very simple testing. So the very first one, as usual, we will require the module web page, and we'll initialize it with the create function. And why don't we pass in the URL as a variable here? And for us, it will be the localhost with port 8000. And let's do a very simple console log statement, and I'll just pass in the URL variable here. Why don't we execute this? So it'll be PhantomJS and then simply project.js. Now if you notice here, it will keep on executing or keep on running PhantomJS because obviously I have forgotten this statement called phantom.exit. So let me try that one more time. Yep, testing on localhost 8000 and it will exit. So after doing a very simple testing for the URL, let's open it up and try to query the title. So in this case, we'll open up, pass on the URL, an inline function with no parameters. In this case, we will very simply do document.title. Now, since this is JavaScript, we can basically query the DOM of the browser. And finally, before we end, let's do a simple phantom.exist. It should be evaluate, not evaluation. And let me run this in the command line and it will just execute the line testing. Well, that's because this console log statement is being executed inside the browser. Now, if we wanted to find out what is in the console, we can actually execute this function called onConsole_message. And over here, as an argument, we'll pass on the message. And now if we do a console log, let's do page title and let's pass on this message. So basically this message will be exactly the same as what's coming out here in the console log inside the headless browser. Let's try this one more time. And there you go, it's coming out as a page title, Hello PhantomJS, which is basically exactly the same as inside the file index.html inside the title tag. So let's add on a little bit of functionality to this little project. So let's create a button, and this button will have an ID of, say, color, and we will basically say change color. So whenever you click this button, the entire background color will change. It's really easy. So inside the script tag, we will do document.getElement by ID, and let's pass on color this time, and we will add in event listener, and upon click we'll pass in an inline function with an argument event. And what this will do is basically change the document.body.style, the background color, and it will simply change it to light blue, and of course the final argument will be false. Great, so why don't we first try this out in our localhost. So I'll go back to my browser, refresh it, and you will see this little button here. So let's click it, and yep, it's changing to light blue. So this is our very simple application. So let me go back to our project.js where we are executing the PhantomJS functions. And before we exit, why don't we try to take a screenshot of this page, and let's do it with this file name called before.jpg. Great, so let's run this once again. Looks like the two console log statements have been executed, and when we come back to a Finder, there you go, you will see a before.jpg here. But if you look at it, you'll see that the entire background is strangely black. Well, that's because our body does not have a color and it is taking it to be transparent. And also, if you notice, it is very small. That means the viewport is really small, so can we change that? So these are the two little things we will do, and we'll try to take a print screen once again. So the very first thing we will do is change the viewport. So in order to do that, in PhantomJS there is also another function called viewport size. And why don't we put it as a typical laptop size? So that'll be 1200, and let's say width will be typically 720. That was the first thing we needed to do. And the second thing we needed to do is set the background color as white. So under, or rather inside the evaluate function, before you get the title, I will simply do document.body.background_color equals to #FFF. Great, so with these two changes, let's try to execute this once again. So in the command line, it will be exactly the same, but when we come back to our picture, you will see that the before is having a white background, but why is it still a small image? Well, that's because it's not width and width, it should be width and height. Let's try to execute this one last time. And when we come back to our Finder, there you go, the before.jpg is exactly how we expected it to be. The next thing obviously we want to do is to have this clicking function and take another screenshot to see that it is indeed blue in color. So to do this, let's include another JavaScript library. Of course, you can simulate the click with vanilla.js, but for the purpose of demo, I'm going to include the library jQuery. So to get a copy of jQuery from CDN, I'll simply go to CDN.js and then search for jQuery and copy the latest version here and include it as part of the function .include.js. So this is a very neat little function that allows us to include JavaScript into PhantomJS. And after this, let's pass in an inline function with no arguments. And let's also similarly do a page evaluate and another inline function. And this time, using jQuery, we will choose the color ID, which is the button, and just click it. And after that, why don't we take another screenshot? And we'll just call it after.jpg. So basically, as you're seeing that it will open up the URL, change the background color to white and take a picture. And this will typically be white background. And then it will include jQuery, click the button, and then take another picture, which will have the blue background. Why don't we try this out? So I'll come to my command line and execute project.js. Well, seems like the headless kit is still running. I have obviously forgotten phantom.exit somewhere, so it should be inside this function. Great, so let's try this one more time. And I also had a slight spelling error. It should be include JS with small s. Let me execute this file one more time. And now when we come back to the Finder, we will see two pictures. One is before, which is having the white background. So we have simulated the click of this change color button. And we also have taken another screenshot, which is after. A very simple example with PhantomJS. Finally, other than the module web page, let's explore a final module, and that is basically the file system. And for this, we will simply require fs. So the file system will basically do some queries on our path. So let's just set this path to simply the desktop and of course the folder. So the very first thing we'll do is, why don't we do a console log, and let's just print out all the project files. And here we will simply do fs.list and then path. Let's try this out in our command line. And there you go, seems like it is printing out all the project files, because when we do a query on what is there, yep, hello.js, and then 2.screenshot, 3 speed, and so on. As a final note, why don't we query a little bit about the newly created images? So after it creates the two images, why don't we print out a little message saying before.jpg, and let's include the size inside some square brackets. So we'll do fs.size, and let's include the path that we have already declared right at the top here, and the file name before.jpg. Finally, let's close the square bracket and then bytes. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing after the after.jpg is created. So let me just change the file name. So as a final note, let's execute this. Oops, there seemed to be slight error in the file path. So it should be slash and then slash here. Let's try it one more time. And yep, looks like, hey, 22,000 bytes and 22,000 bytes is created. And when we come back to our Finder, yep, these are the two files created, which are the 22 kilobytes as defined in our command line. Great, so that was a tiny example on PhantomJS. I hope you found it useful on testing and quickly executing some browser actions as well. Now, it is important to note that PhantomJS is very useful to be used with other testing frameworks such as Casper.js, Phantom Robot, or Mocha PhantomJS. So do check out. These will probably warrant an episode by itself. Also check out other tutorials that comes in the wiki page of the Buzz page, which are really useful in knowing how other developers are using PhantomJS. And finally, for the build link of the episode, it goes to JavaScript Jabber, your prototype for great code, which is a podcast that I've been listening through the iTunes. It's an awesome audio podcast, over 1 hour or around 1 hour each time, but it's definitely worth to listen to the discussions on how other developers are using JavaScript in general. Right, so that's it for this week's episode of PhantomJS Headless WebKit Browser. For all other episodes of Build Podcast, check out build-podcast.com and subscribe through RSS, GitHub, iTunes, YouTube, or Vimeo and get your weekly content. and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.